Now, the problem is this. Natural selection can only select something that is already there. If I want to know which one is better than the other one, then I must have two things, one better than the other one, right or wrong? Right. So natural selection doesn't answer the question, where did the thing come from? It only addresses the question, which one is more fit than the other and can be selected to produce offspring. It doesn't answer the question where they come from. So where does the actual DNA molecule, which is just information and nothing really substantive, where does that come from? Well, science has to admit that it comes about by chance, random activities. So they speculate there was an ancient sea, it was full of molecules, and over time, random reactions created this sequence by chance. Now, what's the probability of just one little gene coming into existence by chance? So we need to talk a little bit about numbers. Well, I use this example because it's simple and graphic. If I had a pile of wood and I put a bomb under it and I make it explode, boom, what's the probability that the pieces of wood will fall into place to form a perfectly functional house? Well, if you work it out, it's probably 1 to 10 to the power of 80. Now that's the number of particles that you'll find in the entire universe. If somebody asked you how many atoms in the entire universe, and then broke it down into particles, electrons, protons, hadrons, quarks, all of those, in the entire universe, you'd have about 10 to the power of 80. So it looks so small, that figure, but in actual fact, it's a very huge, humongous figure. Now the probability of just one gene coming into existence, a small gene, coding, let's say, for 100 amino acids. Your hemoglobin has over 600 amino acids. So a small one would be many, many millions of times greater than even this. So the probability of it happening is virtually non-existent. Now scientists know this, and so in order to get it to work, they have to have a lot of time for these random activities to happen. But it can't just happen once, it must happen many times. So the genes that we have are called our genotype. And that which they express is the phenotype. So when you're looking around, what do you see in your neighbor? His genotype or his phenotype? You see his phenotype. Aha, that's what you look like. That's the phenotype. Now, in evolutionary terms, at the level of the gene, everything happens by chance. So if I want to change anything, I have to have a mutation, and that has to happen by chance, and it has to be, or do I say chance? Whatever, who cares? It has to happen randomly. And then it must be expressed, and only if it is expressed, then it becomes the phenotype. Now, natural selection operates at the level of the phenotype. In other words, that something must be there, then it can work. Now let's make this simple. Let's take a situation where we have a book containing all the instructions as to how to build this aeroplane. Now, that's exactly the same thing. The information in itself, in the book, does not produce the aeroplane. There has to be a process. Is this right? So now the first question is, if this is exactly the same, then the information, the book that has been written, represents the genotype, then how did this book come into existence, according to science? By chance. By chance. So my question is, who wrote the book? Mr. Chance. You've got it. Mr. Chance wrote the book. Because remember, there's nothing there. These are random processes. There's no person or anybody who can write this. This is a chance process. So here is the book. Somebody got a book for me? I like to have a book. Here's a book. That's a good book. Can I have that book for a while? Excellent. This is the best book in the world. Right. Here is the book. Let us assume that the information for the aeroplane came about by chance, and it's all recorded in this book. Now, I will put the book down here. In actual fact, the information is recorded in here, but we'll leave it at that. I'll put the book down there. We have all the information. That's great. Now, all I have to do is wait for the aeroplane to appear. What is the probability of the aeroplane appearing if I have all the information? 0. You're right. The probability is 0. So what must happen if I want to transcribe the information in this book into an aeroplane? I must have some mechanism, firstly, to read the information. Isn't that right? So I need a reader. Where's he going to come from? You're right. He has to come about by chance. Boom! Little house. I have a reader. Now that's great. If I had somebody to read the information, that would solve the problem. The airplane would appear, right? No. So it's not enough to read. What must I have? I must have someone to take the information and to transcribe it, and then I must have a whole factory in order to produce this thing. And then only when it's there will I know if it flies. Is that right? So natural selection only comes into operation once it's there. Now let's see how that works. In the cell, we have the information here in the DNA. It's there in letters that have supposedly been put into an arrangement by this magnificent being called chance. Now, in order to use the information, I must transcribe it. That means I open the page, I make a copy, like a Xerox copy, a photocopy. I send it outside to my factory assembly plant. There I have a factory. Where's the factory come from? It has to come about by chance. By chance. Then I put the piece of paper with the information into my machine. It reads it, and there's a machine which transcribes it into the physical object. Wow! So it's a rather complex process, with all of these enzymes producing this protein in the end, which by itself can do absolutely nothing. So this has to happen hundreds of thousands of times to produce all the processes and proteins that we need to be alive. So how did it all happen? By chance. Now you can believe that if you want to. That's your perfect right. But there's an alternative. It could have come into existence by design. So we have a choice now between the God of chance and the God of design. And now we must determine whether the probabilities of it happening favor the one or the other. But this is highly, highly complex. There are some things in science that are so complicated, and they will only function once they are complete. So there can be no selection along the way. They cannot improve incrementally. It either works or it doesn't. We call that irreducible complexity. So something like the kidney that concentrates urine, the nephron unit inside it, it has to be complete. It is incredibly complex, with channels that open, channels that close, enzymatic activities that carry things across. It is mind-boggling. And yet the whole thing had to come about by chance, because it cannot be improved over time. It either works or it doesn't. Now science says if you want to change something, you have to mutate it. That's like changing the letters in the book. So the nucleotides are arranged in a particular sequence. They work in groups of 3. We don't want to have a science class, so we'll make it very simple. If you remove a letter, it has a very profound influence. An easy example is the cat and the hat. The enzyme reads it in groups of 3. If I delete the C, then it will read the at. So the mutated gene usually is useless. It is nonsense. It makes no more sense. And so mutations are generally bad. Now, in order for evolution to work, you must have a good mutation, a positive mutation. And if you look at the textbooks and you try to find them, they'll have an example. They'll tell you, for example, that sickle cell anemia is an example of a positive mutation. Now, sickle cell anemia is when your red blood cells, instead of being round, are like a sickle moon. And if they are in that shape, then the malaria parasite cannot enter them, and you're not inclined to get malaria. So that's a positive advance in terms of a malaria area. So the textbook says. Is it? Yes or no? No. If you've got sickle cell anemia, you're sick. It's not a positive one. It's only positive relative to something else that's worse, malaria. But it's not a positive mutation. There is no positive mutation. It doesn't exist. So out of all of these negatives, we have to get a positive. So these are some of the problems. Here's another problem. If I have the first cell developed by chance, and it's swimming in the primeval ocean, bloop, 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 and it's an amoeba or something like that, how do I get that single-celled creature to become multicellular with highly complex differentiated cells, like muscle cells, nerve cells, epithelial cells, you name it. There's a muscle cell. Highly complex cell, and there's a nerve cell, and they're totally different. Now, how did they come about? The genes coding for the one and the other are totally different. So in a muscle cell, I must have genes which say you are a muscle cell, and in a nerve cell, I must have genes which say you're a nerve cell. So the original little amoeba didn't have any of those, so where do all those genes come from? You have 2 possibilities: chance or design. So for every time a new gene develops, it's what? Boom, little house. Actually, it's boom, Empire State Building. It's far more complicated than that. When I have 2 kinds of cells in the body, then I get another problem. Then I have to develop a switch. A switch which says, gene, you're switched on or you're switched off. So for example, the nerve cell in my brain has all the information for every other cell in my body. Then how come it's a nerve cell and not every other cell in my body? Because all those other genes are switched off. Tick, 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 tick. Now that's very interesting. So there must be a switch. Where does the switch come from? Hello? You have 2 options. Chance or design. Boom, little house or not. So really, it's not just a question of something happening by chance once off and that's it. It is incredibly complicated. The most complex structures have to come about incrementally. Boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, thousands of times over. How much faith do you need? You need a lot of faith. An incredible amount of faith. Now it gets worse. If I have 2 cells by chance developing, one having genes for muscle and one having genes for nerves, if the twain never speak to each other, of what value will they be? None. If my nerve doesn't tell my leg, lift up, Nothing would happen, right? I would just be a dead piece of meat and a dead piece of brain. So I need genes to say, you're a nerve cell, you're a muscle cell. I need a gene which says you're switched on, you're switched off, and vice versa. I need genes controlling their physiology. I need genes controlling their embryology, and every single one of them, boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house. Darwin knew none of that. I think he would have had a problem. And now here is the mega problem. Every living organism, no matter what it is, whether it's a worm, whether it's a unicellular creature, or whether it's a bird, or whether it's a mammal, all of them have incredibly complex systems which make life possible. From the simplest to the most complex, they have, for example, a glycolysis system. From the simple to the most complex, they have a Krebs cycle. All of these complicated genetic components. Now, here's the problem. It takes thousands of these complex processes to make something alive. Very, very complicated. It cannot happen slowly over time. So if a mammal has it, and this echinoderm, the sea star, has it, and that worm over there has the same processes, and we want to say that these are more primitive than these, then we run into a problem. They all have the exact same complicated processes that make life what it is. So now, if they all have it, there are only two possibilities. As time went by, independently, the same processes happened to evolve in each creature, or, the more logical one, it was there from the beginning. Right or wrong? And if it was there from the beginning, then everything was incredibly complicated from the beginning, and boom, little house becomes a pale little scenario in this story. Now here's another problem. Natural selection, the very word requires that there be two options. Isn't that right? I mean, if you're going to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans, you want those two parties to be there, right? What's the point of going to vote if only the Democrats are there? They're going to win whether you vote or not, right? So you have to have two parties. So everything that you think about has to be doubled up. So here is this powerhouse of the evolutionary process called natural selection, and it's going to select the better of the two to the detriment of the not so fit, and it's going to go extinct. So natural selection is a pretty useless creator because it cannot create anything, and once something is there by chance, the best it can do is to make less and less. Are the species on our planet disappearing at an alarming rate, yes or no? Yes. Which proves that natural selection is so good that soon there'll be nothing left. Now, if it keeps on taking away, then how did it do the reverse in the past? It's impossible. So let's have a look at some of these issues now. Let's say this is the dog rates. Every scientist knows this is one species. Whether it looks like a Chihuahua, or whether it looks like a Great Dane, or whether it looks like a shepherd dog, or whether it looks like a Basset, they're one species. There's no arguing the fact. The question is, where did all of these creatures come from? They were bred from the wolf, right? Now, look at that. Does the wolf have ears like that? No. Does he have a color like that and a hair shape like that? No. By the way, does he look like a poodle? No. Does he look like this fluffy whatever? Yes or no? No. All right? So here we have a problem. Do his ears represent any of these? Maybe close to that, yes. So all of these shapes and sizes must have been present in the wolf if this is what was bred out of it, right or wrong? Right. So all of these genes must have been there, but they must have been switched off, depressed. And the dominant ones that you see in the wolf are the only ones you see. But once you start analyzing, this is what you get. And for each one of these characteristics, there's a gene. Where did the gene come from? You have two choices. Chance or design. So either a designer put all of these alleles into the wild-type wolf, or chance put them there. And if it was chance, you'd have to believe, boom, little house, boom, little house, boom, little house, with no use whatsoever, because they're not even expressed. Does that make sense? Yeah. By the way, let's take this a little bit further. If you had never seen insects in your life before and you came across a big fat caterpillar, would you say that was a butterfly? No, they don't even look alike, right? The one is a worm and the other one is a beautiful butterfly. Are the genes for the butterfly in the caterpillar, yes or no? Yes. Must be. So, why doesn't it look like a butterfly if all the genes are there? Those genes are what? Deactivated in the butterfly or in the worm, depending on which one of the two it is at that phase. Isn't that right? Now imagine that in a broad sense. How much variety could you get in a kind? Anything from a caterpillar to a butterfly. That's an enormous variety. Anything from a chihuahua to a Great Dane. Now here's something other that's interesting. How do you get more variety? Now scientists know that natural selection is a useless producer of variety because it makes less and less. So they have to answer the question, where does all the variety come from? And the answer is sexual reproduction, does it? Because it mixes the genes between two parties and that makes for more variety. But in order to get that, you must have the mechanisms for fertilization, you must have the mechanisms for meiosis, and they in themselves aren't anything, they're just things that happen at the level of the gene. So, male and female, where did it come from? Did it evolve, male and female, in order to produce new variety? No, now you're running ahead of Darwin. It's no longer evolution by natural selection. So somehow male and female had to come about by chance. With all the complexity that it entails at the genetic level, with the meiotic system and all those complex processes, mind-boggling. It came about by chance. The Bible says God created them male and female. Which one came first? Don't you forget it, ladies. The male came first. Genetically speaking now, does Eve have what it takes to produce an Adam? No. Does Adam have what it takes to produce an Eve? Yes. Because we men have every gene that it takes to be a man or a woman. We have an X and a Y chromosome plus all the autosomes, right? Ladies, do you have a Y chromosome? No, so how can you produce a man? So the woman had to come from the man, scientifically speaking as well. There are many reminders that we have everything that it takes to be a woman. Breasts, for example, I have them. They're pretty useless in terms of, feeding the offspring, but I have them. So why do I have them? I have them because a woman needs them. Does that make sense? I have them because a woman needs them. And I can pass that equipment through the genetic process on to the offspring. And if she has the right hormones, then it will be activated in such a way that it will develop like it has to perform the function. But if I didn't have any, the woman would be in trouble. She wouldn't have any either. All right, so male and female came about by chance or design. That's the only possibility. The whole process of meiosis, where the chromosomes join up and separate by random processes, and then cross over information, wow, that's mind-boggling. You know, we can explain it nicely these days. If you have a computer program, a word processing program, and you've written a lot of paragraphs, today it is possible to highlight one of the paragraphs and click cut. Isn't that right? And then to go to a totally different page in my document and go click paste. And then what has happened? My paragraph is now in a new position. Is that right? Now that's what happens in your genes thousands of times over when you divide them up. We click and paste, cut and paste. So the blue one, let's say, is dad's genes, and the red one is mom's genes, and so we cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste, until we have a total mix-up of the two. But I have to cut it very precisely. One little mistake, one little letter too far, and the enzyme would come along and read, and you wouldn't be a human being but a cabbage. A precise process which does nothing but move paragraphs of information around. It doesn't produce anything, just changes the sequence. And then when it's read and made into the product, that's when natural selection takes over. So how did this complex process come into being originally? You have two options: chance or design. Now this is what can happen. You see, we have different chromosomes. Here's a long one, and there's a short chromosome. And if we fuse them together, then we get a long chromosome. Is there any new information there, yes or no? No. It's the exact same information. It's just in a different sequence. And what can happen? Well, here's a creature that has such a fusion. It's the largest antelope in the world. It's called the eland. And it has nice twirled horns, and it has stripes on the side. There's another one, has the same fusion, twirled horns, stripes on the side. It's the kudu. You get a lesser and a greater kudu, two varieties. Here's the nyala. In fact, if you looked at the male and the female, you wouldn't even recognize them as one species. They're so different. Here's the female. You can see the stripes nicely. Here's the male. Stripes are much finer. Twirled horn. There's the bongo. Stripes, twirled horn. There's one of the smaller antelopes, the sitatunga. Stripes, twirled horn. Question. All of these, is the difference between them any greater than the difference between a chihuahua and a shepherd dog? No. So isn't it possible that they're all one kind? And if you want to believe in the story of an ark, then isn't it becoming plausible that the number of species that went in are a lot smaller than we actually imagine? Gets less and less. Here's a fascinating case. Here is the wolf. Now the wolf has 76 chromosomes. And this is the variety that you find in the wolf. Now when you go to the jackals and the coyotes, they have fewer chromosomes very often, sometimes 38 chromosomes. Then they discovered that if they have only 38, then they're very long. And if it has 76, then it's very short chromosomes. So they did some mapping and found out, wow, it's the exact same information. They just fused together. And then you get this magnificent variety. So now, if you look at the dog races, you will know that that is the same species as that. The small one is the same species as the big one. But when you come to the wild animals, they make them all different species. These are wild dogs. I would like to suggest they're all one. And the difference between them is just differential activation of gene systems. It's very interesting that the jackal, the fox, and the coyote can, under certain circumstances, interbreed quite freely. For example, the wolf will interbreed in Canada with a central coyote, which is large, but not with a coastal one that's smaller. But the central one will interbreed with a coastal one. So there's a link all the way through. And if we come to this animal, then it's very, very fascinating. This is the dingo, and this is just a common garden hound. I don't want to be rude to it, but I just selected him because he looks exactly like a what? Dingo. Like a dingo. Now if you go to Australia, the Australians are very proud of their dingo. Very proud of their dingo. And this dingo is protected wildlife. And it is an evolutionary phenomenon, this dingo. But the dingo is going extinct. Why is it going extinct? That's right. It's breeding with a dog. So with all respect, what is it? It's a dog. I'm sorry if there's an Australian in the audience, but it's a dog. Do you know that they even know that historically? They even know that the dingo was derived from Asian seafarers that came to Australia and their dogs got lost while their ships were in the harbor, which didn't exist at that stage. So it's a dog. It's got nothing to do with evolution. So all of these wonderful gene processes that we have, they came about by chance or by design. Transposons. When a gene can jump to another location and in one generation create a big rat or a small rat. So all of these magnificent genetic processes that Darwin knew nothing about, the built-in variation in the gene pool, the reproductive exchange, the meiotic process, the crossing over during meiosis, the recombination, the transposable genes, the drastic rearrangements, all of these he knew nothing about. Now, how did all of these complicated systems get into our gene pools? They either came about by chance or design. The choice is yours. So let's have a look at old Darwin and his problem. If you look at the races of man, and Adolf Hitler, for example, was a Darwinist, and he used his Darwinistic philosophy to say that one race was superior to another. And the same process has happened all over the world. In Australia, in the 1940s, you could get a license to hunt Aborigines. On the basis, yes, the 1940s, that's not so long ago, right? On the basis that the one race was evolutionarily superior to the other. Now, when we see a poodle that has curly hair and black hair, do we think that it is genetically inferior to an Afghan that has long blonde hair? No, it doesn't even come to mind. But when we see a black man that has black curly hair, and we see a Swedish blonde, are there some people that would note the fact that the one is genetically or whatever superior to the other? Yes or no? Depending where you live, right? Depending where you live. So all of these races, where do they come from? What's the difference between a black skin and a white skin? The same colorant, the same pigment is present in both. The one is just more active, the gene, than the other one, right? So melanin is more produced in the one than in the other. There's no genetic difference. It's exactly the same. I put this up just to show the ladies that men are more handsome than women. Now let's look at these little children. Here is an Asian girl, and she has slanted eyes. Now that must be evolution, right? No. All that happens here is that the eyelid has more fat deposited in it during development than in a Caucasian. So both have fat, both have the genes to make that possible, but in the one it's more active than in the other. And that could just be a question of where it has been transposed to a position where the enzyme reads it more often. It's got nothing to do with evolution.